And today's webinar is taking control of landscape photography with Datacolor in the Nik collection. I'm joined by Dan Hughes, who is a
Hey,
member of
folks.
the. Hi Dan, how you doing?
Good, good.
And he's an accomplished photographer and also a member of the Nik team. And we're going to divide responsibility for this webinar today. I'm going to introduce you to some color management concepts that will help you take control of your color, both in camera and during image editing. And Dan is going to talk about the Nik collection and some very interesting techniques for image editing, image manipulation, that sort of thing. So let's begin. We're going to start with a concise review of front-end color management tools. Those color management tools will help you stay in the driver's seat and stay in control of color in capture and editing. And then we're going to move on to examples of leveraging several of the Nik collection applications to maximize the details and impact of your landscape images. I think in particular you're going to find that these two segments are very, very good together in the sense that you first have to have control of your color. You first have to have the color on your screen, for example, or color coming from your camera that's absolutely accurate, because if they're not, then you're editing to basically an incorrect destination. And so if the color is incorrect at the beginning, it's going to be incorrect at the end. That doesn't serve you well. So what we're trying to do is get you started off on the right foot. We're going to talk about getting it right in the camera. We're going to talk a little bit about getting it right on screen, and then I'm going to hand off to Dan and talk about getting it right in the image editing phase. So color management, what's color management really do for you? It enables you to efficiently reproduce consistent, predictable, and repeatable color. And that's across a range of devices. That can include your camera, your display, your printer, a number of devices. And the idea is that you can use your equipment on a particular day and come back to it and get a repeat performance that's virtually identical to the first performance. A calibrated workflow is always more efficient and predictable. You're not going to find yourself in a situation where you're getting an unexpected result. That the equipment and the devices that you're using should deliver consistent performance over time. As an aside, we're not going to get into printing, but one of the symptoms of not being in control of your color is a situation where you're making a print, you bring it back to your screen, it doesn't match your screen, you make a tweak or an adjustment to the image, and you go back and make another print, and you're into a print tweak, print adjust cycle, and instead of making 1 or 2 prints, you make 4 or 5 proof prints, which is very expensive and is a big waste of time. Now, one of the first things, of course, is to get it right in the camera. Most high-end DSLRs and mirrorless cameras give us excellent image quality, but the fact is that every sensor and lens combination, you change the lens on your camera or you change cameras, each combination has its own color signature. And what I mean by color signature is the way it renders color is slightly different in many cases. You can have 2 cameras from the same manufacturers and even with supposedly identical lenses on them, and they may render color slightly differently. Front-end color management can allow you to harmonize those 2 cameras and get the same color from both cameras at the same time, which can be very, very useful whether you're in the field or in the studio. This can also enhance your exposure performance and help you fine-tune exposure, and I'll show you how to do that in just a little while. We'll be talking a little bit about in-camera versus custom white balance, and those terms may be familiar to some, but not all of you. But in any event, a camera calibration and profile gives you a bump in color performance. Now, one of the devices that Datacolor makes is called the Spider Cube, and I think of it as a gray card on steroids. It's much more than a gray card. It can help you with exposure management, in-camera white balance, in post-production with gray balance, and managing dynamic range. It's useful for handheld and tethered shooting in post-production. I want to mention that we did a complete webinar on the use of the Spider Cube, which is recorded, and it's on the website at spider.datacolor.com. So here's one of the things that's very interesting is that the LCD, when you take a photograph with a DSLR, the LCD shows you a semi-processed JPEG, not a picture of your RAW file. And so whatever you can do to increase the, how do I put this, the strength of the JPEG or the accuracy of that JPEG, whatever you can do to improve that is going to serve you well in evaluating the quality of the shot that you just took. Now, there's a couple of things on here that can be very, very helpful. First of all, if you've enabled the exposure indicators on the LCD and you take a shot, you'll see at the top, I'm going to back up one slide. See at the top here we have a chrome ball for specular highlights. We have two gray faces, two white faces, a black face with a hole in it, and we call this card black and absolute black. Now,
Hey,
if
David,
you take it, yeah?
out of curiosity with that, maybe you're going to cover it a little bit more. When we shoot an exposure of the cube here, should the white portion, the palette there, should that be blinking? Is that like
That's a great question. The one thing that should always be blinking, and can you see my cursor on the screen?
Yep.
All right. The one thing that should always be blinking, should always have a specular highlight on, is the chrome ball. That's what it's for.
Okay.
And then the white areas, particularly the brighter side, whichever side is brighter on the cube, should not be blinking. If it's blinking, it means that you're overexposed.
Okay.
Okay. And now, of course, your histogram can also confirm this, but this is a very easy way to see a number of things or learn a number of things about your exposure right at the beginning. So if it's blinking, you're overexposed. If you can't see this black trap, which I've circled in green for convenience, if you can't see that, then you're underexposed. So now, let's say you're shooting, just for example, you're shooting in manual mode. You might want to make an adjustment in your exposure to try and capture the maximum dynamic range in this image. So if you're seeing the blinks, or if you're not seeing the black circle, you would adjust your exposure accordingly, whether you're underexposed or whether you're overexposed. And then again, you would use the manual exposure to fine-tune. Now, in some cases, for example, this image on the bottom, you can see that there's a shadow surrounding the highlight. And I'm kind of wishing now that I had a larger version of this, but I'll make the point anyway. This image was taken in high contrast light. So I had to make a decision here about how to govern the exposure, particularly since this radiator on the front of the old car is very bright. I decided to go for the detail in the radiator and let the shadows drop out wherever they would go. So if I had a picture of the spider cube in that same light, you would probably not see the black circle. But that's an artistic decision, and at least you're in a position now to evaluate it and understand what that decision means for that image as you go forward.
And then
Now,
also with those, because it's a JPEG representation on the back of the camera, theoretically you do have a little more leeway, right? When in the RAW file, if you're shooting RAW, to properly get the highlight information. But then if you need to pull a little bit of shadow detail out, that's usually possible.
It can be possible. It depends in part on what ISO you're shooting at and what the capabilities of the camera are as far as shadow detail goes. Many cameras, the newer cameras, such as the Canon 5D Mark III or the Nikon D4, have excellent dynamic range, and yes, you can pull detail out of the shadows. There are older cameras where if you were working at higher ISO and you tried to pull the detail out of the shadow, you would get a lot of noise. So in part it depends on the camera. It's a really good question. It's an advanced question. But it would really depend on the camera and its ISO handling capabilities. There is also some software available nowadays that can help in reducing noise in post-production, but I'm not going to get into that. You might want to address that later on. Now, just to keep things going, as far as in-camera white balance, you can see, over here that this is a panel from the Nikon instruction manual. There's a similar panel like this in the Canon instruction manual and other camera instruction manuals, and there are settings that you can access that will adjust the camera to a particular white point. So, for example, 3000 for incandescent, or 5400 for flash, or 5200 for direct sunlight. But here's the problem: is that there's no settings for the in-between color values. So when you use the on-camera white balance, um, the problem is that you don't have access to any kind of adjustment that's in between. And so what's better, far better, is to use a gray source. You can actually use the whole spider cube. You can fill the frame in the camera. It doesn't have to be in focus. And you can push the white balance button and then the shutter, and you can set the gray balance in the camera, or excuse me, the white balance in the camera as a custom setting. And you can get these in between settings without having to resort to the buttons. And again, that's going to improve a couple of things. It's going to improve the appearance of the JPEG that you have on your screen. And since the histogram is derived from that JPEG, it's going to improve the quality of the histogram as well. So using a gray source or the spider cube, the proper gray source or the spider cube, you're going to be in a position to really be in the driver's seat and really nail the color, really get the color as close as possible to an exact adaptation to your lighting condition. Now, if your lighting conditions change, I'd strongly suggest that you do this again. So if you're indoors and you're working with incandescent and fluorescent lighting, say there's mixed lighting, you've done a custom white balance in your camera and things are working fine, and you walk outdoors and you continue to use that white balance, you're going to have issues. Now, of course, they're raw files, and of course, you're going to have an opportunity to work with it in post-production, but it's much easier if you get that white balance correct in the camera when you start shooting. It's going to save you a lot of time, effort, and maybe even some aggravation down the road. Now, here's a brief representation of how you might use the spider cube in an image editing application. This happens to be Capture One Pro, but the principles are the same whether you're looking at Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw or Capture One Pro or Focus. In one panel, control panel, or another in these software programs, there is going to be a white or gray balance eyedropper. One would click on it, come over and click on the gray panel on the spider cube or on the gray source. One of the great things about the spider cube is that being a multi-dimensional object, as you can see, one side is lit more brightly than the other. That means that that more brightly lit surface is your indicator for your primary light source. So we want to balance to the primary light source. We don't want to balance to the secondary light source. So we're going to balance to the primary or dominant light source to get the most accurate result in post-production. Now you can see this is an industrial shot. I realize we're talking about landscapes, but it's much more difficult to see on screen on the internet. So I used an indoor shot for this. And you can see that with the lighting in the room, there's a lot of blue color bounce from the outfit that this engineer is using, among other things. And so you can see along the steel rails and the white fascia or the housing on the control panel here, the things look pretty blue. But in post-production, if I can come over to the spider cube, as you can see where my cursor is pointing, and I can color correct the image, it neutralizes very, very nicely. If you're working with an application like Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, you can actually make this color correction, then apply it to all of the images in the same lighting condition in the same folder. So it's very, very efficient workflow. Now let's talk for a minute. I'm not going to read you this slide, I promise, so please don't log off. This is I put this information in here so that if you wish to go back to the recorded webinar, you can dig into the details. Very briefly, the spider checker is a tool for profiling your camera. You can also use the gray patches in post-production to neutralize the color if you have a color cast, but the best use of this is to create a profile for your camera and achieve maximum performance from each camera and each camera lens combination. Software is provided with this device, and it will export those profiles or presets to Lightroom, Photoshop, and Hasselblad's Focus. It's very straightforward. We have a camera utility. You import the file into the camera utility. You don't have to convert this to a DNG file, which is a big advantage. It makes for a much more accurate profile for the camera. There are other software packages and patch kits that require you to transform or translate the file. This package does not. You would center it with these small squares in the center of each color patch, and you would run the software, and it would save it to Lightroom or save it to Adobe Camera Raw. Let me just move forward one second. Okay. In Lightroom, it would be accessible to you as a preset in the Develop module. And then in Camera Raw, you would go up to this small icon here and get the drop down and go to Apply Preset, and you would apply the preset to the image. If you open multiple images in Camera Raw, of course, you can apply the preset to all of the images that are open in Camera Raw at that time.
And one thing that I hear about pretty often with color management is the importance of it being correct, right? And I think that's the main point. But the other thing about like the cube and the spider checker, and correct me if I'm wrong, David, is it helps to speed up your workflow in the post process, because if your color is correct, you don't have to muck with it later on. You have to do far less work in the raw process, as well as with like the Nik tools. It becomes a more creative process, more than a sort of corrective process if you're using these sorts of devices.
Well, that's right, and the fact is that say what you will about raw files, and the fact that you can, as you say, muck around with them or adjust them later on. It is more work, and it's painstaking work. And if you've got a client, for example, that is in a hurry to get some comps right after a shoot, or if you've got a tight schedule and you're lucky enough to be very busy as a photographer, or you're working on a magazine deadline, you really don't want to be in a position where you're guessing about the color, or you're trying to adjust color amongst multiple images so that you have matching sets or a body of work. And it's what it reminds me of is, it's a little bit like lighting in the studio, is that 5 minutes extra time of working with lighting in the studio and getting it absolutely right can save you 3 or 4 hours in post-production. Mm-hmm. And I'm not making that claim for color management, but it certainly will save you time sitting in front of the computer and will give you, in general, a better result. And so I strongly urge people to put a little bit of work in up front to get a significant benefit downstream. And what that does for you is it gives you more time behind the camera and less time in front of the computer, which I think is something that we would all like to have.
Yeah, most definitely. Or more time for sort of like the creative process rather than...
Or the creative process, yeah. Why be messing around with adjusting colors when you could have done it up front?
Yeah.
And really spend your time and energy on the creative process and really making some impressive images. Now, the opposite side of each spider checker sheet, each of these sheets flips over in the frame, so you can turn them around and you get a neutral gray target. There are no patches in here that are warmed up or otherwise changed, so you're always going to get a neutral result without any color influence. And these can be used for validating you can take a picture of this and validate your display neutrality. You can actually use this in the way I talked about using the spider cube to set your custom camera white balance. It's very fast. Those of you who are shooting video, I want to make a quick point here, is that a lot of people use the on-camera buttons to set white balance in the camera, or they use a white card to set the white balance in the camera when they're going to shoot video. Neither way is ideal, in particular using a white card for in-camera balance with a video card. White cards can pick up ambient color and throw your color profiling off. I would much rather see you use a purpose-built gray card for that. Get it close to the camera, fill the frame, and set the balance for that lighting condition. I think you'll find that you can get very, very good results. It will help you harmonize the color balance between cameras. Let's say you've got more than one camera in a shoot. That goes for still and video. And you can also use these for checking lighting intensity and evenness. So it's a very, very effective multi-purpose tool. I have several camera bags. I have at least 2 or 3 of these there, and several of the spider cubes. They're in every camera bag. If I don't have it, of course, I can't use it. We're going to talk briefly about display calibration. I know that most people, but not all, calibrate their displays. And again, we're in the same situation, is that if the color on your screen isn't accurate, in other words, it isn't adjusted to a standard color set, you're working on your images to a destination that may, well, it may just give you an unexpected result. You're heading towards a destination that's kind of an unknown one. I would much rather be working on color knowing that it's going to turn out the way that I expect it to, the way that I intend it to. Display calibration works in much the same way that the spider checker works. It analyzes a series of color patches and compares them to standard colors. And the software calculates the difference between the displayed patch and the standard patch. That's one thing that it does, and it corrects that color so that it's accurate. One of the most common things that happens is people are making prints, they're sending out to a lab to have prints make, or they're making their own prints. They say their prints look darker than their display. One of the things people don't realize about a display calibration cycle is that it also manages the dynamic range of the display. It manages the brightest settings, and it manages the luminance, the highest luminance, and it manages the shadow. So you're protecting your highlight and shadow detail. Most monitors come out of the box set to maximum brightness, which is at least 300 candelas per square meter. That's bright enough to read text in a brightly lit office, but it's definitely not the right setting for editing photographs. I don't care who you are and how good your eyesight is. The actual luminance that you need for that kind of thing is a half to less than half that, around 120 candelas per square meter. And candelas is simply an engineering term that measures the brightness of the brightness on your screen. Hang on one second, I have a small problem I have to deal with here. Okay, there we go. All right, and so the people say their prints look darker than their display. They look too dark, and that just means that the display is too bright. So that the display calibration device is going to help you set that screen brightness and your shadow point to the correct levels.
So David, with that, with the 120 lumens, is that, or not lumens, but candelas per what, square foot?
Square meter, yeah.
Yeah. That's so that what you see on screen, the luminosity or densities on screen matches what you'd get out of a print? Is that the?
Yeah, and in general, what's going to happen is that your shadow and your highlight detail are going to be very, very close to what you're going to, in other words, the screen and the print are going to match, probably at about the 95% level, both in terms of luminance, highlight and shadow detail, and in terms of color accuracy. I do installations all the time for other people, and in a range of printers, including Canon, HP, and Epson. And invariably, once I get the camera, the display, and the printer calibrated, that the color accuracy and consistency is remarkably good. So it's really, excuse me, it's really a it's something a lot of people think that they don't have to do. They can do it by eye, but it's really not possible to do it by eye. Your eye and brain are so adaptable to changes in white balance and luminance. They're too adaptable, and you need a device that will make it a more consistent process and also hold it to a standard so that you can do, like you said before, you can do your creative work instead of trying to guess what your color is going to be. Mm-hmm. Just a quick point, I know there's a lot of people out there that have a Spider 3. The Spider 4 has been out for a couple of years. Spider 4 has been out for a couple of years. It's 26% more accurate than the Spider 3, but more importantly, in my opinion anyway, more importantly, I think that it does a better job with some of the new displays that are coming out that have a wider gamut or more intense contrast and saturation. It will help you control that, again, so that you can harmonize your output with printers or other output devices such as electronic displays. So what happens here, and you can, this is a schematic, and hopefully this will get the point across. The display calibration, as each patch is shown, the optical sensor in the calibrator reads that patch and the software decides what the patch should look like and makes the correction. It saves it to a correction file. That correction file is used to adjust the display every time you start your computer. The calibration is good for about a month. I typically set mine to remind me once a month, and I calibrate my display on the first of the month. It's an easy date to remember, and that way I make sure that I actually get it done. You could go a couple of months and get away with it, but I find that if I just do it on the first of the month, I always remember to do it. As a side note, wide gamut displays are absolutely no problem. The new iMac is absolutely no problem. 3 or 4, well, more like 4 or 5 years ago, the iMac did have problems with calibration. Those are gone forever. Apple's taking care of it. And you can also calibrate your iPad and your iPhone. This is a quick look at the software screen. I'm going to move on to Dan in just a minute here. This is what the software screen looks like. I just want you to take note of the settings here. Typical settings are gamma of 2.2, 6500, and 120. I would stick with those unless you have a reason not to. The first time you calibrate, you can do a full calibration, which takes a few minutes longer. Going after the first time you do a calibration, the recalibration is perfectly adequate. This is some test results. It simply shows that the display that we were testing delivers 100% of Adobe RGB. This is a screen that shows you the difference before and after. It's very useful in the sense that you can switch between a calibrated and uncalibrated view, and you can see down here I broke out the uncalibrated view. Look at the greens in this particular image versus the green over here, or the blue in the sky around the church versus the blue here. And you get better color density and what I call more natural color, colors that are more analogous to their natural counterparts.
So with that, I mean, it's kind of interesting to take a look at that, because if I opened up, you know, that photo, let's say of the church, and on an uncalibrated screen, when I go into my post-processing, I'm probably going to, you know, completely change the color and add way more contrast compared to what would happen if we had the calibrated screen, which is, you know, the corrected screen, in which case, you know, you wouldn't have to do A, as much work, and B, it would be correct and you'd be able to see exactly what you're getting, right?
Right, and if you're incorrectly adding contrast and saturation to an image, generally speaking, you're killing detail in some part of the image. So all the hard work that you've done, you know, to achieve good focus and good depth of field is now starting to be destroyed by the fact that you're over-editing your image because the on-screen color is incorrect.
Cool.
Okay, I think it's about time for us to get rolling on the Nik collection. So I'm going to hand off to Dan. And
sounds good. We'll switch the screen here. Thank you, David. That was awesome.
Okay, thank you for your comments and questions.
Let me know when you can see the screen, because I know it takes a second to switch over.
Yeah, I don't see it yet.
Okay. So I click show screen now. Good to go. And that's not displaying properly.
Oh, I see it. Now I see it.
Yep. All right, and we can see the whole image here with my my cursor down in the bottom.
You're good.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much.
Beautiful photograph.
So before we really jump right into the Nik collection, I want to give you a little introduction to the software. We're going to open up individual pieces of software. I want to explain each one. You know, in the write-up for the demonstration, we were talking about using Viveza 2, ColorEfexPro, and Sharpener Pro to be able to control our images. Now, of course, we first have to have our screen calibrated and have everything be sort of refined in that way before I would even want to go in to edit an image, right? As what David was talking about, that all applies, and that would be done first. Then we would go into our raw process and edit however we might, you know, feel necessary, and then go into the Nik Software set of plugins to adjust from there. Now, I'm not going to start with this image, but this is more of a typical workflow. You know, whether you're using Photoshop or Lightroom or Aperture, it doesn't necessarily matter. The software is going to work almost exactly the same way. The only real difference That is, in Photoshop, you're dealing with layers and layer masks, and therefore you have blending modes and stuff like that. In Lightroom and in Aperture, and in fact, I should say everything that we're going to be taking a look at today will work, whether you're launching from any of the host pieces of software, or from Photoshop, Lightroom, Aperture, or Photoshop Elements. Now, what you're looking at right now on my screen is the original raw processed image. And I actually processed the photo to be a little bit more flat, pulled out a little bit of shadow detail, because with the calibrated screen, you're able to see exactly what you're going to get. Therefore, if I pull out my shadow detail and try and retain whatever highlight detail I can see it on screen, and then when I add contrast or adjustments to color, or remove contrast if that's the goal, it is consistent, it's good and clean, and then I can push it up to my website, or print it, and it will come out properly. Now, of course, dealing with web stuff might be a little bit different than making prints and so on, but that's sort of another conversation. Now, we're going to take a look at the Detail Extractor, Viveza 2, and Color Effects in a couple minutes. So if we take a look, there's the before, there's the after. Again, this is a typical workflow where we might use multiple pieces of software from the Nik collection to actually edit the image. For our kind of intro, we're going to be looking at using individual pieces of software. So I'm going to start out with Viveza 2, which is a tool for editing light and color. And one of the things that you're going to notice with Viveza 2, with the entire Nik collection, basically, out of the 7 plugins, 6 of them have this kind of control, and that is control points. So I might suggest utilizing your raw process to get as much information and detail as you can out of that raw process in a global function, and then go into the Nik plugins where you have these wonderful selective processes. Now, also within the Nik plugins, you do have global adjustments. So you can see here on the right-hand side of my screen, I have a global brightness, contrast, saturation, structure, shadow adjustments, warmth, red, green, blue, and hue. And what I'll sort of point out is you usually, especially with properly calibrated and properly white balanced images, you usually won't even have to get into these global blue, green, and red sliders, and probably even warmth, unless you want to work in a sort of more creative process. I think these tools were initially placed in the software to help people fix issues, to clean up color problems, and so on. But like I said, with those calibrated screens and being able to sort of make a consistent workflow out of that, you won't have to do those sort of corrective processes. In this case, though, on this image, I do need to correct the image just a little bit, but not really the color, and not really even the density, because what I'm seeing is a corrected version of this image. What I want to do is kind of balance out my tones. That is, the highlights within the sky here, the clouds, they're much too bright. And the detail in the shadow, although we were able to kind of pull a little bit of it out, it's lacking contrast, and therefore we don't have a whole lot of depth to the photograph. So using these control points, I can selectively adjust all of these different objects, but without having to make any actual selections. I don't have to cut out the clouds with a lasso or a pen tool or anything like that. I can just simply drop a point, size my area of influence, which we're going to be talking about in just a minute, and then simply go into the adjustments panel here of the sliders and adjust brightness and contrast. I can desaturate those clouds if maybe they had a little bit of a skewed color, or maybe we're shooting at sunset. You'd have a much warmer set of clouds probably. Well, in that case, you could even go in with a more creative process, warm the clouds up more, or adjust the red, the green, and the blue. So you're able to control all of these different aspects and areas within the image very selectively and very easily, without having to spend much, if any, time actually making these selections. So you literally place the point on the object that you want to adjust. The control point makes the selection for us. I'm noticing that because this is in shadow, it's a little bit too cool. So just to sort of warm up that portion of the image, I might go into the warmth slider, push that up about 20%. We could even go in and remove some blue, right? And again, this starts to become this very creative process, and because of the consistency of having that sort of calibrated setup, it makes it so that what you see on screen should be almost exactly what you're going to get in print. Now I'm just going to place one more control point down here in the foreground. I want to add a little bit of contrast and add a little bit of structure. This structure slider, for anyone who might not be familiar, is a sort of texture adjustment. It's fine detail rendering. As I slide this to the right, you can see I'm increasing that structure and sort of bringing out the little deviations in the reflections of the clouds there. So I'm going to go ahead and push that to maybe 50%. I'm going to show you a before and after, because even though we've only worked on this for about a minute and a half, we have a much improved image in terms of the contrast, the depth within the photograph. And theoretically, we could even just click that OK button and then move into something like ColorEfexPro if we wanted to push that even further.
Dan, there's one thing I wanted to say that I really like about the way this works is that it does make the selection for you, is that the control point senses where it is on the photograph, and then your adjustments affect areas that are similar to that, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
And so
in fact,
someone like me who does a lot of commercial photography, I wind up making very, very precise selections. It's really a relief to go to edit a landscape photograph with the Nik collection and be able to do this.
That's a great point as well. And the other thing that you can utilize this for is for combining selection methods. That is, let's say we had to be not only precise but exact with an edge. You can go in and use these control points to make the initial selection that's going to look something like this. And what I've done here is I've just clicked on the checkbox that's to the right of the label of the control point on the right-hand side here. And this is showing us the actual selection that this control point's making. So what I'm noticing is that, let's say this is a commercial job, the edge here is doing a good job to make that selection, but we are going in and we're affecting this area just a little bit. We can solve that within the Nik tool by simply adding another control point, placing that in there, or we can make all of the adjustments that we see fit, click the OK button or the brush button here in the lower right-hand corner of the interface, and then because what happens, and I'll show you this in just a second, is that you get a duplicated layer of your background. You can then use whatever other tools you might find necessary to kind of refine that selection even further, right? So, and I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second as well, but let's just take a quick look at the before and after. So there's the original image, and there's the enhanced. In fact, if we use the split preview, it's easier to see here. On the left is the original image, on the right is the enhanced, and you can see we were getting a lot more depth out of those tones in the landscape. And yet we're working, this took 2 minutes, if even that. So if we needed to, I could click that OK button, and then like David said, if you were working with maybe something that needed to be even more precise, because something like a tabletop product, so if you're shooting stuff like that, the color has to be exactly spot on to whatever the branding of that object or that thing would be. In which case, you can make the selection initially with the control points inside of the Nik tool, and then if you needed to, you can use whatever Photoshop selective tools you might need to. So it makes the very precise selection much easier, since the tool already did 95% of the work for you. All right, so that's Viveza 2 in a really quick nutshell, because I want to get into not necessarily advanced stuff, but show you an actual workflow when utilizing more than one of the individual pieces of software, because that's more typical than using maybe just one of the Nik tools. In this case, I want to show you one of my favorite filters within ColorEfexPro 4, which, by the way, ColorEfexPro 4 is a collection of 55 individual filters. It ranges from skin retouching filters to color and contrast sort of correcting filters. So maybe if the image is a little bit flat, you can utilize something like a Pro contrast filter to optimize the contrast very easily without necessarily stylizing the image. Then there are traditional tools like graduated neutral density filters and graduated color filters, solarization, polarization. They're things that you could do with film or in a sort of more traditional well, analog sort of process, if you will. And then, excuse me, the last kind of filters, the fourth kind would be stylistic filters, like a midnight filter, or even my favorite filter, or the one that I find myself using most often, the detail extractor filter. This can be used for correcting, or it can be used for more of a stylization of a photograph. And I think this image is a good example of that, because if I click my compare button in the upper left-hand side of our interface here, this is the before image. And if you notice, the water in the center of the photograph isn't necessarily blown out, but there isn't a whole lot of detail that's noticeable. And what the detail extractor does is it goes and finds any of that information, as long as it's not blown out or black, blocked up black 000, and it allows us to get that detail and actually balance it to the rest of the image if we wanted to do that. So that's sort of a corrective use, and that's what we're going to do here. But if you wanted to use this filter for more of a stylistic effect, I could bring this detail extractor slider up into the right, maybe take it into sort of a faux HDR kind of feel. So I'll add some contrast and a little saturation. And this is sort of taking it pretty far here, but just so you get a good idea to the filter, there's the before, and there's the after. Now that's not my goal in this case with this photo. So I'm just going to double click on all of these sliders, and it will home those sliders. It'll get them back to their default setting. And really the only thing that I need to do here, or the only thing that I feel I need to do, and Dave, if you feel like we should go even further with this image, feel free to let me know. But what I really want to do is simply bring the detail out of the water. So to do that, I'm going to use a control point to place the detail extractor just in the water. We'll take a look at the selection and make sure it's doing what we need it to do, and then maybe remove it from any areas where we don't want it if we need to, using a minus control point from the right-hand side of the interface.
Yeah,
so I clicked on the plus
detail would be the detail would be the area that I would focus on.
Okay. And I always like, sort of spitballing with especially someone like David who does just absolutely beautiful landscape photography stuff, because what he might do to an image is going to be probably a little bit different, and because we think in a very different way, I'm sure, there's a sort of collaboration that could be really interesting there. It's kind of fun to do that. Now, I placed my plus control point right there in the center. If I turn this on and off, what you'll notice is that it's doing a great job to kind of balance out that detail, and it doesn't take it too far, right? We could, if I brought those sliders all the way to the right or further to the right, but in this case I just want to correct that portion of the photo. Now, if you ever want to see the selection that's being done by those control points, if you click on the words control points here on the right-hand side of the interface, it opens up into a list of all of the control points you've used. In this case, we only have one, so we only get one within the interface. But if I go and check that checkbox on, just like what we did within Viveza 2, you actually see the selection. Anything in white, I think I might have mentioned this already, is being selected. Anything in black is not being selected. And then anything that's a shade of gray has some of the effect of that detail extractor. Now, the reason the tool does that, it doesn't just segment or pull just that water out, is because it wants to create a very clean selection, and it wants to make sure that whatever we do there in the center or on a particular portion of the image, it is nicely balanced with the light and with the tone of the rest of the image. Now,
that's a really good point. Is that you want to balance the tones? That's a test of the work that you're doing. Is once you start to adjust those tones, does it match with the surrounding areas?
Exactly. Yep. And to that point, sometimes I might want to leave this portion of the image being affected a little bit by the detail extractor or by the particular filter that we're using. But like in this case, I don't think we need any of the detail extraction on the rocks, because there's plenty of detail in those shadows and in the portions of those the details of the rocks and the moss and the lichen. So what we can do to maybe unbalance or to further balance the image is to continue to use control points. In this case, using a minus control point, I'm just removing it from that rock right there. In fact, to show you a little bit more, if I take another minus control point and I place it down here in this rock, you'll notice it just immediately turns black. And that's because now this section of the image is not being affected at all. And you just continue to drop your plus and your minus control points to kind of refine exactly where and how much you're putting the effect in. When you do this, I might suggest, taking a look at the selection here within this mask sort of section of the interface, but it's almost more important to place your control points while you're looking at the actual information, the actual image itself, because sometimes it's like you're working in the dark almost. You get to see this really beautiful selection with these control point, the masking there, but at the same time, with effects, certain effects, I should say, the mask is less important than the balance of the photograph. So sometimes you do want, this effect, in this case, like detail extractor down here, but I wouldn't know it. I wouldn't be able to visually see it if I was placing control points down here just to kind of clean up the selection that I think I want. So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind. Now, just to do a quick compare, again, there's the before. There's the after, just using the one filter within ColorEfexPro 4. We might add more filters to this image, maybe enhance some of the color and separate the lichen off of the rock a little bit by maybe cooling the rock and warming up the lichen or something like that. But for the sake of time, and I want to show you sort of a more full workflow, we're going to move on to the next image. So here we come to this one. And like I said, David, if there's creative things that you're seeing that you want to do differently, let me know. It's sort of fun to sort of spitball off of that stuff.
Okay.
I'll throw it back and forth. Now, as I mentioned before, this is a photograph that was brought through Adobe Camera Raw, actually in the RAW process, and I purposely made it a little bit more flat in the RAW process because there's a lot of information in that raw file that I might not be utilizing if I don't use, the shadows and the highlights and the blacks and the different sorts of tools that exist within those raw processing tools, or even the noise reduction. Now, there's great noise reduction with Define 2.0, but I find myself only using it when I need to do selective noise reduction, like with control points or color ranges in Define. There's Adobe Camera Raw and Lightroom both have really phenomenal noise reduction, and then DxO's Optic 9, their new raw processing, has an even better noise reduction tool. It's brand new technology. It's rather amazing. So when I can, I streamline my workflow, so I won't always use something like Define if I don't need to. Right? And that goes for pretty much any tool. And that's the beauty, again, of the calibrating properly, is that if I don't have to correct this stuff in the post-process, I can just go in and sort of make it a more stylistic or possibly more creative kind of process than, again, corrective. I probably stress that too much, but I think it's really important. So,
Diane, I have a question for you.
Sure.
On the upper right at about 3 o'clock, you can see some of the, I presume this is a dawn shot, but I could be wrong. Oh, I just saw that color come up. So you already did make that adjustment.
I did in the process. So this is the original, and then going into what we were going to talk about, that was the enhanced. And in fact, looking at the left-hand corner, this although it shouldn't necessarily be the exact same color as over here, maybe we would want to go and add a little bit more blue or cooler tone up here. So.
And then over here on the left-hand side where the hill is green, I see some opportunities there too for just a little bit more saturation.
Cool. Okay.
Or
let's try and do that one within Viveza too.
Okay.
Okay. And just let me know when we go. In fact, if there's a ColorEfexPro 4 filter that you would use instead of something like Viveza, let me know, and we can just open that up and take a look at it. So in this case, we're going to use sort of multiple processes of the Nik collection. I'm going to use ColorEfexPro 4 a couple times. Usually, if we can, I get it done in one visit to whichever plugin we happen to be opening up. But in this case, on this image, what I kind of want to do is correct the overall contrast, and I also want to start to bring out a little bit more detail. So, in this case, I really just need the detail down here in the foreground, which it looks a little bit bland with it off, with the detail extractor off, and then maybe even bring the detail out, which is sort of, we've got this atmospheric haze or a fog that's coming over these mountains, and you'll notice the detail extractor, it does a good job to retain the haze, yet sort of cut through and get the detail. In fact, you kind of start to see one of those sort of a ray of light coming through here and right there too. It's interesting. Oops, as I click on the wrong button. So again, what I want to do is just focus on the detail in the foreground. So I'll go and place a plus control point there, place a minus control point in our water here because I don't need to extract any of the detail, and I kind of like the fact that it's sort of muted compared to the trees there in the foreground. And then maybe just one plus control point over here as well to get a little bit of detail out. Now as we do that, I think this might be sort of the introduction to what David was talking about, is there is an opportunity to get a little bit more color out of there and maybe even change the color because it's a little bit cool right now, and I think we could probably warm it up just a touch, or maybe even just make it more green. But there, that detail, that you get that little extra bit of pop. In fact, let's hold down the Option button on my Mac, or Alt if we're on a PC, and I'm going to duplicate that control point to place it over here as well, because it seems as though it wasn't getting the exact same effect over here. If you ever need to duplicate a control point, there are a few different ways to do it within the Nik collection. The easiest, or the one that I default to, is just holding the Option button down on a Mac or Alt on a PC, and then you click and drag, and you'll get an exact duplicate. And that will work within any of the Nik suite, any of the tools within. From here, I'm just going to add a little bit of contrast using that Pro Contrast filter to sort of correct the overall image. And as we do this, as I bring this out, I want to watch my histogram, which right now I don't have my histogram open. I have the loop function open in the lower right-hand corner. So I want to change that. So I move down into the lower right-hand corner, click on histogram, and this should actually just simply, it seems as though it snapped on. That was interesting how it did that. But I've clicked on my histogram, and now I can actually see the information within my image. From there, I think I've corrected the contrast. It's gone a little bit too far. And I'll take my highlights slider to the right. This is going to let me protect the highlight information. In fact, with this slider all the way at 0%, you can see we're actually clipping a little bit of the information in that lower right-hand corner of the histogram. And it looks like it's in the red and the yellow channel. You can see that because it's basically telling us that in the histogram it's red and yellow. But if I take my highlight slider to the right a little bit, I can protect that highlight information. So that way, if I make a print out of this, I don't have anything that's blown out. We have good detail and no sort of gloss differential or anything, any problems like that. From there, let's just take a quick look at the before and after. There's the before. There's the after. I like our results, so let's click that OK button.
It's coming
and we're going to
along
jump
nicely.
into Viveza 2 for the creative process. Go ahead, David. I'm sorry I cut you off there.
I just said it's coming along nicely. It's got a lot. There's a lot in here. It's really a beautiful image.
And this was a photo by a fellow Googler. Emily Chang is her name, and she was, I can't recall exactly where it was, and this little boat might be somewhat of an indicator, but I couldn't tell you exactly where she shot this, but she did a great job shooting it, most definitely. So let's go into Viveza 2, and the reason I want to use Viveza 2 at this stage instead of sticking with color effects is I really want to get into using the red, the green, and the blue color sliders selectively with control points, because we can control each aspect of each object basically. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just drop a control point. We've already done a little bit of work down here. This is a little bit too yellow, I'd say, for me. So I'm going to go and drop my control point, and I'm going to add just a little bit of blue. And then I'm going to actually add a little bit of warmth as well, which kind of sounds counterintuitive to add blue and then add warmth. But the warmth slider will, as I slide it to the right, start to introduce all of those warm tones. So it'll actually introduce magenta and red as well as yellow. But by adding in the blue, we sort of retain the right color of the trees. If I just went in and added warmth to the trees, then it would sort of start to turn red or magenta and yellow, and it might look strange. Now, placing control points on each object can be incredibly important for nothing less than just making sure that the water isn't being affected by a control point that we placed on the trees. Now, again, as David and I both mentioned, what these control points do is they actually look for the object that you've placed the point on. Right? You're going to be looking for the similar tone, color, and texture, among other things that the control points look for. But as you can see here, as I go and I take my warmth way too far, the effect is going into the water just a bit, and I don't think that we want to do that. So by placing an extra control point in here, it actually neutralizes. It reverts all of those tones back in the water, but yet it kept that extra warmth that we've placed in the trees, which was far too much, but I just wanted to show you how that was working. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to go in and just make some adjustments relatively quickly. I want to add some saturation and
Dan,
some more blue.
If you want to go a few minutes over time, don't worry about it.
All right. We probably will. But I want to make sure that we can cover all of the stuff that we definitely wanted to. And so I guess I just won't sort of announce necessarily exactly what I'm doing. In this case, I am placing a control point in the blue sky, or the blue portion of the sky, and adjusting that color, bumping up the saturation, and cooling down the warmth a little bit. So removing a little bit of warmth starts to introduce blue and green and cyan. I say we go in with our control point and do almost the same thing over here. The reason why I'm not just duplicating this control point and placing it over here is because in this case I'm going to throw it on a cloud, and because the initial colors and tones are so different, I want to sort of start from scratch in this case. So sort of cooling these tones, because I probably don't need to push the clouds as far as what we did with the blue of the sky, but add maybe a touch of saturation in there. And then, as David suggested, let's go into the side of the mountain here and kind of clean that up as well. And really, you just place points, and as you adjust, if for some reason it's affecting an area you don't want it to, you just place a point in the area that it's affecting that you don't want it to, and you clean it up. Or oftentimes what will happen, at least in my own workflow, is I'll think I want to affect a portion of an image in a certain way, and I'll notice a control point kind of doing something different than I expected, and I'll leave it because it's actually better than what my initial idea was. So I'm going to darken those tones down. I'm going to add a little extra saturation in there, and it's going a bit blue, so I'm going to actually remove a little bit more blue. The beauty of the red and the green and the blue sliders here is that it really gives you fine-tuned control over that color and a great creative kind of process. When you're dealing with red, you're working with red and cyan. So if I add red, I'm actually removing cyan. And if I go into my green slider, as I reset this just a bit, if I go into my green slider, we'll be dealing with magenta. So as I add green, I'm removing magenta. Or if I slide this into the negative, I'm removing green and I'm adding magenta. So for anyone who might have worked in a color darkroom, this is going to work the same way as your color dials would. For anyone who might not have worked in that state, it just gives you this amazing amount of control over the actual color and the color channels.
Those color pairs, by the way, are the same color pairs that you see on a normal color wheel. So, for example, blue and yellow are opposites on the color wheel. And so as you add more blue, yellow diminishes, et cetera, et cetera. So their analogs exist outside the lab as well. As so-called normal artists would use a color wheel, we can use those analogs in the Nik collection.
That's a great point. Yeah, I kind of relate it back to what I've used it for, and it really does have sort of a wider swath than just that. Now, all I'm doing is duplicating each one of these control points. Got a little too much saturation down here now. And again, all I did was just hold down the option button, click and drag, and this gives us this really nice resulting color. Now, if we take one quick look at the before and after, we've done no real contrast adjustments, really. We're just controlling the color within Viveza 2 in this case. And that's the before, and there's the after, and you can see we're starting to really get that pop out of the image. Now that we've developed the color in such a way, there's a filter within ColorEfexPro 4 that's called Brilliance and Warmth. And the Brilliance and Warmth filter allows us to control color in a different way than what we were able to do here within Viveza 2. Because there's a certain algorithm or slider in there, it's called Perceptual Saturation, which will allow us to increase the saturation in a way that's much closer to the way the human eye sees color. So, and I'll show you that instead of just talking about it, but I was letting the ColorEfex open up. So, as we open it up into ColorEfex, you can see the first filter we used the last time we opened it up. So you can see it's applied to the image. We don't want that filter, so I'm just going to move over to the left-hand side, and I'm going to utilize the Brilliance and Warmth filter, and I want to use it twice, actually. The first time, I'm going to take my Perceptual Saturation slider up into the right to increase the color, and then I'm going to go and take my Warmth slider to the left to start to cool the image down. The reason I want to do this is because I want to cool the cool parts of the image, that is the blues, the greens, cyan stuff, and then I want to warm the warmer portions of the image. So by placing these control points, we can start to zero in on all of those particular colors. And I can place minus control points just to make sure I don't affect the things that should be a little bit warmer. And now we can start to really get a lot of pop out of that color. In fact, let's go ahead and just click the Add Filter button. And if you're going to do a process like this, that is, if you're going to use the same filter twice on an image, generally I would suggest doing it very selectively, as what we're doing here. Because if I just went over, if I added the Brilliance and Warmth, cooled it down and added Perceptual Saturation, but it was a global adjustment, it affects everything. And then if I go and use Brilliance and Warmth again, what's going to happen, here I'm just going to go ahead and X that out, add it again, what's going to happen is that we are sort of working in the opposite direction, right? I would be warming the whole image and adding Perceptual Saturation, which wouldn't make much sense. And it's sort of a good example. I wouldn't do that, or I should say I would work in this same way if I wanted to maybe use tonal contrast or the detail extractor. You can use that multiple times in one visit, but you do just want to be kind of careful when you do that and do it very selectively. So there's that little spot of color. And we're just going to finish the image off with a filter called the Darken Light Center filter, which works in a way that's very similar to a vignette. It's just a vignette typically looks as though you can see it. It's noticeable as a consumer or a viewer of the artwork or the piece of the image, as opposed to Darken Light and Center, which gives us a little bit more of this subtle sleight of eye kind of vignette. As I toggle that on and off, there's the before, there's the after, so that I don't necessarily blow out any more detail. If I did, I'm just going to take a minus control point and remove it from some of these highlight areas here. But as we finish, I click my OK button. That brings us back over into Photoshop, and we've got our finished edited image using the collection of the Nik suite. Now, I don't know, do I have enough time to quickly get into Sharpener Pro?
Yeah, why don't we try and wrap it up by 10 after the hour?
Okay, sounds good. I will knock it out really quickly, because the beauty of Sharpener Pro is that it's almost completely automated. And in fact, if you want to see more about any of these individual pieces of software, if you want to hear more about it, you can find the information on the Nik collection both at niksoftware.com, where we do have an archive of 250 videos on YouTube, but you can find it by going to niksoftware.com. And then also on our Google Plus Nik Photography page. You can find it there as well. There's tons and tons of tutorial videos that explain not only how to use the software sort of technically, but also get you into more creative uses for the tools. Now, really quickly, what we would do with the output sharpener, if we were ready to print this image, if we had finished everything, done a quick maybe soft proof of the colors and so on, we would go into the output sharpener. We would choose the way that we plan to output the image. In this case, let's say I'm going to print it on my inkjet printer. And then my interface changes a little bit, but really the only thing that I have to do is answer these 3 questions with the inkjet output sharpening, and we will get the ideal amount of sharpening for this image at this size. So I guess what I'm saying too is that if I plan to print the photograph, much bigger or much smaller, I want to make sure that I change my pixel dimension before opening up into the output sharpener, because what this expects is that we're sharpening for this particular size. But all you've got to do is go into your viewing distance, leave that on auto actually, go to your paper type, change the paper type so that it pertains to the particular kind of paper that you plan to print to, because each different kind of paper is going to need a different amount of sharpening, because of the simple fact that, you know, when using inkjet anyways, you're spraying ink down on a piece of paper, and that ink absorbs into the paper, and a matte paper is going to absorb a different amount of ink than, let's say, a glossy paper would. So you do want to sort of adjust for that. And then also your printer resolution, you do need to set that setting, and it will pertain specifically to the printer that you're using, and then the settings that you use within the printer. But once you've answered these questions, your sharpening's done. That's all you really have to do. There are other bells and whistles. You've got some creative sort of global sharpening effects, as well as control point capabilities. So let's say I decided, well, I don't necessarily need the corners or the clouds up here to be sharpened. I could take control points, and we could add sharpening if we needed to, or control the structure, local contrast, and focus. Or, and what I'm going to do in this case, is just remove the sharpening, which is sort of blasphemy probably, because, you know, when we're spending several $1,000s on lenses, you know, you want the corners to be completely tack sharp. In this case, I'm just going to go ahead and remove the sharpening, and this should very subtly push the viewer's attention towards the center, or towards the you know, the area of interest within the image, because my corners, especially in this image, aren't so important. So I'm not so worried about making sure that they're tack sharp. Now, as a technician, again, that's sort of blasphemy, but as an artist, that might be a decision that you'd make. But that's Sharpener Pro in a nutshell as well. And that's probably you know, a good amount of information out of me for that.
Well, okay, it's been a great session. I think that this is the first time that first of all, we've done an international audience, which has worked out very well. We had very good attendance. I also noticed that the questions ranged over quite a wide area, and people were very engaged. I'd like to point out to people that, again, a lot of these materials are available on YouTube for the Nik collection, and on the Nik website, and of course they're available at spider.datacolor.com. We have all of our recorded webinars available there. We won't be having any more webinars in December, but very soon we'll be announcing webinars going into the first quarter of next year. Again, my co-host is Dan Hughes. My name is David Saffir. I also wanted to point out that I have a blog, davidsaffir.wordpress.com, which has a lot of how-tos and technical information and such, and I'm actually planning a significant overhaul and update of that starting in the beginning of January. And I will answer questions from students. My email address is dsaffir@mac.com, DSAFFIR@mac.com. I travel a lot, and if you find that I don't answer you within 24 hours, please don't be afraid to email me again and ask the question again. It just means that I missed you on the first try. We appreciate you attending the webinar. We hope that you'll come back and join us again. Thanks very much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thanks again, everyone.